hope, going to change his Twitter bio soon as legitimate journalist. He works for the Young Turks under Cenk Uygur. Perhaps you've seen him on the Jimmy Dore show. He worked for Vice for a little while, and an afterthought is what made them part ways. Perhaps you know him for that. But I hope you guys enjoy him. He's honestly one of the most hard-hitting journalists I've seen. He will ask questions that other journalists, you can visibly see them get annoyed while he's doing it. And he makes them squirm. So, Michael Tracey, everybody.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Isaac. I appreciate you conferring legitimacy to me, finally. It's something I've long sought, finally achieved. So the trip to El Paso was worth it. It's funny that in my introduction, it was mentioned my departure from Vice. And people constantly want to ask me about what actually happened there, so I will give you a little gift in going through that incident. Not because I think it's particularly meaningful or that it implies much in a broader sense, but people find it amusing, so why not? On the day of the election in this past November, I got a tip from a source of mine. That tends to be what journalists do. They receive tips and they investigate and try to corroborate what they've been told. And what I had been told was that Lena Dunham, who is not somebody that I ever really cared about, honestly, had not actually voted in the New York State Democratic primary. Now, if Lena Dunham had just been some celebrity who goes in public and tries to preach to her followers, it wouldn't be of much interest to me, but it so happened that she happened to be an official surrogate for the Hillary Clinton campaign, both during the primary when she was campaigning against Bernie Sanders and during the general election. So I thought there was some public imperative that it be promulgated that she had actually deceived people as to whether she had voted in the Democratic primary. Now, the reasons that she hadn't voted are sort of a little arcane to go through, but in short, New York State has a very Byzantine voter registration process, probably one of the most corrupt in the country, by the way. And you had to register for your particular party primary the preceding October. So the primary occurred in April, and you had to switch your party registration or register for a party in order to vote in the closed primary the previous October. So Lena Dunham wouldn't have been the only person to fail to do that in time to be able to legally vote. Other people who were not able to vote in the primaries in New York that year include Ivanka Trump, Eric Trump, and many other people who were obviously not fully aware of the idiotic laws in New York State. So Lena Dunham wouldn't have been alone in her folly there. So she really could have just been honest about not being able to vote, right? But then she wouldn't have any lies to try to retroactively rationalize. So I basically figured out that she hadn't voted in the Democratic primary because when you put her information into the New York State voter registration database, it showed her as an unaffiliated voter. And if you're an unaffiliated voter, you cannot vote in the closed primary in New York. So that was the total confirmation that she had deceived people. And again, the only reason that her deception was relevant and in the public interest to illuminate was because she happened to be acting in the capacity of a surrogate for a presidential campaign. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been particularly interesting. So I did about probably 90 seconds of research to corroborate that. I tweeted it out. I put out the a screenshot of the New York State government website, which verified that she had in fact not voted. And I kind of got off Twitter for the day just because I was reporting. I was in North Carolina, which is a battleground state. I was talking to voters, trying to get a sense of how the day's affairs were proceeding. And then gradually I got a sense that something a little weird was happening. There were people who are in the anti-online harassment community who perceived what I had done as intolerable because I had, quote, doxed Lena Dunham. Okay, so Lena Dunham in 2014, and this is getting into such petty details, but whatever. She had purchased a landmark property in Brooklyn Heights in 2014, and when she purchased that landmark property, which was formerly the headquarters of the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, a newspaper, her purchase was published in all the local media, and it included her address. It's almost like we know what the address of Trump Tower is, right? I mean, we know what the address of the Dakota building is, because those are prominent landmark places where people happen to inhabit. So the same was true of Lena Dunham, who was a multi-millionaire celebrity and purchased this very luxurious residence in Brooklyn Heights. More power to her. But in her purchase led that information to be made public by all the local media. So literally all I did was very cursory Googling to figure out what her address was, because in order to input the requisite information of the voter registration database, you have to find a person's address and date of birth. Date of birth was on her Wikipedia. Not hard. I do some journalism that's a little more intensive than this. Let me just assure you of that. So I did this very basic investigative endeavor, right? And I found her information, put it in the voter registration database, found that she was unaffiliated, put it out on Twitter, and I was accused of doxing. So I think there is a legitimate concern about doxing. I mean, if you're just an ordinary person and all of a sudden your private information gets disclosed in a public forum, you rightly may have a concern as to who might seize upon that information, what they might do to you. But once you're a public figure, as Lena Dunham I think plainly was, and once you're working in an official capacity for a presidential campaign, and once you have your landmark properties address published in New York City real estate media and all the local blogs, your expectations of privacy sort of diminish. So while there is some value in having a social norm against doxing as a means of inflicting punishment on people who are unsuspecting, or of simply embarrassing people just sort of as a crude sort of cudgel, what happened was the definition of doxing got broadened to encompass what I had done, which was basically just basic journalism. I mean, it wasn't even that highfalutin journalism, it was just really, really sort of rudimentary. But what happened was there was this big outcry. I had to kind of justify why I hadn't doxed Lena Dunham. Lena Dunham did a whole tweet reply, and it kind of blew up beyond what I had conceived of was possible at the time, because really it was truly just an afterthought. I was more focused on covering the presidential election in North Carolina that day. But once that story gained momentum, it just became sort of a bizarrely dominant feature of my life for a while, which is why I'm leading my speech with it. But I think it does have broader relevance in that it shows how certain concepts which have value in discrete ways, so this anti-doxing norm, end up getting exploited for politically expedient ends. So the people who were most upset that I had revealed that Lena Dunham hadn't voted the Democratic primary that year and had deceived the public were the Clinton loyalist crowd, who were protective of their surrogate and didn't want to get mired in that discussion. So they kind of arrogated to themselves the license to use the doxing frame to try to delegitimize somebody who had illuminated that deception. And again, there are much greater and graver deceptions in the world to illuminate, so I'm not trying to put it on a pedestal. It just sort of happened to impact me, and that was apparently how Isaac became aware of me, so Isaac, thank you again for that great honor. So it so happened that Vice severed their ties with me at that time, and that was okay. To actually have no hard feelings for Vice. They were a great place to work for some time. So then let me move on from Lena Dunham finally, and let me just give you a postulation that I think will be widely agreed with, hopefully will be. If you seek out the least credible opponents of the position that you wish to rebut, then your rebuttal is necessarily going to be weak. Now, why do I bring that up? I think there is a culture that has developed in the libertarian/conservative online commentary sphere, which is sort of a hazy definitional phrase, but kind of roughly gather what I'm talking about, where what they'll do is, and of course there are always exceptions, this is necessarily a generalization, but what they'll do is they'll take the most egregious examples of left-wing or liberal excess and use that as the basis for their critique of all left-wing movements. So, in other words, they're taking the weakest possible examples of the ideology that they're presumably trying to rebut and elevating it and saying, this is the counterexample that I'm working in opposition to. So let me read to you a passage quote. On some elite college campuses, the student activists are obsessed with symbolic gestures and the rigorous policing of language. Now, that quote was contained in a publication not of the right, not National Review, not Breitbart, Daily Caller. That critique was in the magazine Jacobin, which is a socialist magazine. So sometimes when I see these online conservative commentators, whether on YouTube, Twitter, in written form, sometimes when I see them, working themselves into a frenzy, and sometimes the frenzy can be justified, these excesses are real, I wonder if they are aware that there is a robust and vibrant left-wing critique of the liberal identity politics that they are so aggrieved by. And if they're not aware of it, then they're not really grappling with the most formidable form of the politics that they perceive themselves in opposition to. And therefore, that sort of leads to a weakness of reasoning. I mean, if you want to strengthen your reasoning, if you want to have the most formidable possible argumentation, then you want to identify the strongest possible proponents of the opposing viewpoint. And ordinarily, college students, behaving badly and, chanting and sloganeering, not the best representatives of the left-wing viewpoint writ large. So that is something that I've noticed quite often, and I think it serves to impede the ability to effectively communicate across party lines. That's sort of the impetus of this conference, Bridging a Divide. Well, in order to actually bridge a divide, you want to take in good faith the arguments that are being leveled against you. And when the main sort of drive among people on the right is to simply rebut the weakest possible opponent of the view that they claim to oppose, the bridging any divide becomes less feasible. And of course, this mode of conservative politics has been around, I don't want to say forever, but for a very long time. What happens to be new now, I think, is that social media has amplified this style of critique, such that anytime some idiot teen somewhere does something excessive or egregious, it becomes a national story because you have it on video, you have people who can instantaneously film their rebuttals to it or write it up, and it becomes just absolutely dominant in the national discussion, whereas in times past, it might have just fallen by the wayside and nobody really felt compelled to offer anything like a full-throated counter-argument or rebuttal because it just wasn't particularly significant. So I think there is a sort of a distorting incentive structure that has developed around social media that people can't necessarily change. Everybody inhabits a world where social media tends to set the terms of our discourse now, especially if you, like me, are working primarily on the internet. But what you can do is be cognizant of those potentially distortive effects. Self-awareness is something that I always try to encourage. The least self-aware group of people probably on earth are journalists, and especially pundits. I mean, we can almost forget that, but think of how just dreadfully wrong virtually everybody who was paid to express a political opinion was about the 2016 election. Dreadfully wrong. I mean, wrong to the point of just the type of humiliation that in like the Middle Ages would compel you to be ostracized from society. Not figuratively, but like, literally you would have to leave the town and go into some kind of remote place and like live out the rest of your days in shame. That's how wrong people were in these elite media spheres. So that's sort of been a bone of contention for me, trying to encourage accountability among these elite media clowns and charlatans and hacks. Hacks is a great word, actually, to describe them. Trying to demand that when you commit such a massive failure and your one job is to correctly analyze political trends, then maybe you should incur some professional sanction or repercussion as a result, but none of them did. So that is a different sort of realm of commentary than than the online conservative, anti-social justice, pro-free speech sort of subset. But the idea that self-awareness is an imperative applies just as much to that emerging subset as it does to these elite media clowns who committed one of the worst failures of all time. So you should be self-aware of those distortive effects. I would say consider, is what I'm rebutting here the best representation of the argument that I want to undermine? If not, is there a better approach? Obviously, there's no one set of guidelines here, and certainly I'm happy to join in when a crowd of rambunctious guys wearing black masks or whatever try to physically impede people from consuming speech on campus, which I think is sort of a fundamental right. But at the same time, there can be sort of an excessive reaction to that, and it becomes maybe excessively dominant. And then I think it's also really important to recognize that there's huge dissension on the left about the value of these anti-free speech incidents that we've seen pop up around the country of late. They kind of almost direct back to the 2016 primary campaign, which was hugely contentious within the left internally. I mean, the right had a very fractious primary as well, and that's what the media tended to emphasize because the media kind of likes to point to right-wing fissures, whereas they sort of downplay left-wing fissures for whatever reason. But there's a fissure now as to the utility of those anti-free speech incidents that can be traced back to, at its origins, to the Democratic 2016 primary, if you can believe it. As somebody who was sort of immersed in those debates, I can assure you that they were rather heated. So I think all of this relates to how a general theme and how I tend to approach political commentary. I now work for an organization which is reputedly on the left, progressive. That's how they kind of define themselves institutionally. But what I have within that organization is a mandate to be relatively autonomous. And I think that's useful to me because I want what I say to be what people are reacting to rather than some affiliation that they perceive that I have with some other institution. So prior to joining TYT, I wrote for publications across the political spectrum. I'm still a contributor to the American Conservative magazine, recent magazine, that I've also written for, I started at The Nation magazine, which is the flagship left-wing magazine in the country. And why did I find that something that was worthwhile to pursue? It was because if you're writing for a variety of audiences, it forces you to be ironclad in the veracity of your arguments and of your reasoning. Because if you have to communicate to the widest possible audience, then you can't rely on these sort of mental shortcuts. You can't rely on just invoking a certain phrase like virtue signaling or like fascist. I mean, you actually have to explain what you mean on the substance and have people reckon with that, on its own terms. And I feel like a lot of the internet commentary that I see is sort of overly reliant on the invocation of these terms. Like the virtue signaling is sort of a funny one. It's become really popular on the right. I think if there's some merit to it, but I'm always sort of amused because constantly talking about virtue signaling is itself a form of virtue signaling. And I'm sure there are some people who are self-aware enough to know, to discern that irony, but who really knows? Anyway, I wanted to touch on that because it has broader implications beyond commentary. It has to do with the strength of your reasoning faculties. If you're not relying on shortcuts, if you demand that the logic be assessed on its own terms, then you're less amenable to being distorted or mischaracterized. So I think that's just a good lesson overall. And it also goes to how we perceive our current politics. So something that's frustrated me on the left and in liberal commentary circles is this idea now that whatever Trump does is bad merely by dint of Trump doing it, rather than because the thing is actually bad on its own terms. And you saw an analog of this on the right under Obama. I mean, it's sort of just a truism of politics that people are going to fall into these tribal formations because it gives them sort of a shortcut to comprehend politics. And to be fair, not everybody in the United States needs to be an avid consumer of politics or even has the time or ability to be. So it makes sense that they might kind of reach for these analytical shortcuts, but if you're in the business of commentating on politics or on social trends, then you kind of want to avoid that temptation. So a great example was in the first week of Trump's presidency, he formally abrogated the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. And you saw like some people on the left for whom that issue had been like the #1 concern of the entire 2016 campaign. Like, go look at the photos of the Democratic Convention in 2016 in Philadelphia. All the Bernie delegates were waving no TPP. That was the big chant. That was the big pressure point that they wanted to demand that their representatives uphold. And the reaction to Trump abrogating TPP was just like nothing. It was just incredibly muted. And so that raises the question, I mean, were you concerned with TPP on its own right, or is it like intermingled with your feelings about Trump? If so, maybe you should try to evaluate why that is. And another great example I can think of now was in 2013, and it's doubly relevant right now. In 2013, you'll recall that Obama went before the nation and said that it was his decision that he would intend to strike the Assad regime in Syria, but he would put it to Congress to deliberate. And you had bipartisan opposition to this, and you had a lot of Republicans opposing this initiative, including Republicans who are sort of mainline, not really Republicans with a pre-existing critique of U.S. foreign policy. They seemed to be against it purely because they didn't like Obama. So it was always like, I mean, are you opposed to regime change in Syria? Are you opposed to Obama? I mean, if you're opposed to both, you should try to disentangle those notions just for the sake of rationality. And unfortunately, right now, that irrationality that was on display in 2013 has returned. I mean, Trump has now attacked the Syrian regime after kind of a blinkered 48-hour frenzy that, I don't know about you, but for me, it was hard to even kind of get my bearings on how quickly everything proceeded, because Trump had, for the entirety of the 2016 campaign, argued against regime change in Syria. I mean, it's indisputable that that was a main plank of his program. So for him to just completely reverse course in the space of 48 hours because he saw a plain child on TV, I mean, come on. Does anyone really believe that? I don't even think Trump himself believes that anybody believes that. But that's just sort of what he went with. It's very obviously a charade. It's funny because Trump has made into a charade things which were previously sort of only implicitly farcical, but now the farce has like come to the surface, so that's sort of like the perverse utility of what Trump has done. But I think, if you were opposed to regime change in Syria during the entirety of the 2016 campaign, and you supported Trump on those grounds, then you're not being consistent if you don't now oppose that endeavor. I mean, if you don't care about consistency and you're just reflexively partisan and you want to cheer the Republican president, hey, that's fine, but at least be honest with what you are doing. And another example on the left, and I'll wrap up shortly, is this Russia mania, which has just consumed the sort of political and media elite now for the past number of months to a degree. It's just mind-boggling. And it's sort of another analog of this because you see, prominent liberal pundits and Democratic, superstars invoking concepts like treason and the Manchurian Candidate, and using kind of Soviet-era iconography to demonize Trump and elevate this purportedly sinister foreign leader who we all have to be very scared of, who is somehow omniscient, Putin, and he's like orchestrating all these disparate events all around the world. And it couldn't be that Trump just won because the country's political institutions have dramatically failed. It had to be because there was some kind of subversive foreign intervention that everybody has to be really concerned about. So what they're doing is they're appropriating what were traditionally more right-wing oriented tropes to just further these short-term political ends of undermining Trump, weakening Trump, stymieing his agenda. So again, if your number one priority in life is to stymie Trump's agenda, I guess that's a justifiable course of action. But if you're more consistent and you prize logic to any reasonable extent, maybe you would have apprehension about that. So these are the consequences now of this kind of faulty reasoning that is really predominant in our politics. I mean, it manifests in different forms, and it has destructive consequences. I don't know about you, but I'm checking my phone every couple hours to see if World War III is upon us. So if that's a result of this irrationality, maybe there is something to be considered here. But I laud Isaac and the group here for endeavoring to bring together people of disparate beliefs to try to come to some sort of, maybe not consensus, but at least accord, let's say. I think that's a worthwhile endeavor. And that will do it for me. Thank you.